is an associate professor of archaeology and anthropology at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Brighton has been researching various facets of the Irish diaspora, I say that right, diaspora, at home and abroad for over 20 years, and he's excavated extensively in the United States and in Ireland. So the core focus of his research is to understand the materiality and the dynamics and resiliency of the culture structuring cultural change and continuity over time and through space. He has written numerous peer-reviewed articles on various sites relating to the Irish and Irish American laboring communities, and he's done a book on the archaeology of the Irish diaspora titled An Historic Archaeology of the Irish Diaspora. And currently, Dr. Brighton leads an annual field school in County Cork, Ireland. And there's his Facebook page and his research website on there. Okay, now I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Brighton.
Okay, and this may take a second. Let me see that, and then I'll get it on. Let's see, did that work? Are we good to go? Oh, wow, okay. I don't want to move it. And as soon as I start talking, I know the dogs upstairs will start barking, so I'll apologize in advance for all the noise if it happens. But thank you for inviting me to come and to meet you guys and to talk about the Irish in Baltimore County and the archaeology of it. So I figured I would just give you just a little background about my thoughts on why I do what I do, why the Irish diaspora, both in Ireland and in the United States, and why Texas. And that's what I thought the focus would be tonight, and show you some artifacts in looking at and how we sort of reconstruct or try to interpret what everyday life was like to be not only an Irish immigrant coming into Maryland and Baltimore County in the 1840s, 1850s, but also subsequent generations of becoming Irish American and what that actually means and its impact. So I figured that would be the sort of crux of tonight's talk. Hopefully I don't keep you too long. If I do go way over, just either, I don't know, leave meeting or wave and I'll shut up. So I just wanted to just, fill in why do this, why the Irish. And it's always been an interest of mine in terms of immigration history. If you look at the climate, the social climate today towards immigration to the US, the interesting sort of history of celebrating immigrants or celebrating our heritage today, whether it's Irish immigrants, Italian heritage, German heritage, so on. And especially the Irish on, say, St. Patrick's Day, right? Where everybody is Irish on that one day. And it's a very celebrated day in various ways, whether you're going to Chicago and painting the river green, wearing green, going to the parades, right? But there's a real pride in the idea of the Irish as part of the American story. And what always interested me was, in the 19th century, and certainly in the 18th century, that wasn't true. That the Irish were one of the first, outside of the English and colonization in the 17th and then early 18th century, they were the first real immigrant group to come in very large numbers. Now, the Irish have come well before the famine, which is around 1845, 1846. And certainly there's been Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants in Maryland, dating back to St. Mary's City. There is a failed sort of colony, if you will, up by just at the head of the Chesapeake River that was going to be called New Ireland. And that sort of fell through and then became Cecil County. But that's a whole another kettle of fish. That was in the middle of the 17th, end of the 17th century. So the Irish have been around since the founding of Maryland. So this isn't, where I start with Texas is sort of like coming into the movie midway. But there's a very important reason for that. There's a different kind of attitude towards the Irish. And there's a different type of of Irish culture coming in by the mid-19th century. But really, this is how they're actually seen. So these are different drawings from places like Harper's Weekly, Punch, and other social media of the time, right? This is where people got their information or their misinformation. And this is how the Irish were actually sort of portrayed. They're portrayed as dangerous. They were to be mistrusted. They would never assimilate or become part of the American population, that they would be, because most of them, especially at the time of the famine, were Catholic, that they would create this invasion from within America and take over. There are numerous congressional hearings from the late 18th into the 19th century about Catholics and their allegiance to the Pope. And quite simply, what the fear was that if you're Catholic, right, and then the Pope decided to create a holy war and then came out and said, I want everyone to rise up and kill all the non-Catholics. Just hypothetical. And this is a debate that they had, that Catholics and Irish Catholics in the United States would have their first allegiance to the Pope and create this holy war in the United States, which was predominantly, not all, but predominantly Protestant. Right, so that's where we get the Alien and Sedition Act in the last few years of the 18th century. So for those who have taken it or know people who have taken the oath of allegiance when you get your citizenship as an immigrant, even today, you pledge, your first loyalties to the United States government and the United States, whether it's a king, whether it's the Pope, it goes down a whole list of things. It was the Irish coming in that basically caused some of the first immigration laws of when someone could be a citizen and what were the parameters of sort of people being worthy of citizenship. So I juxtapose the idea of the images between St. Patrick's Day today versus what it was like in the 19th century. And really it sets the context for what it was like to be Irish, an Irish immigrant, an Irish American in kind of the middle of nowhere in the 1840s in Baltimore County. So the beauty is, you all know where Baltimore County is. So we could cut to the chase. You know where Baltimore City is. So here's an aerial. If you see Baltimore City down at the bottom, the big red square, if you know the area, should be familiar. That is the giant quarry, Lafarge, that is there today. 83 sort of cuts along right to the left of it. And right where that giant white limestone quarry is really where the initial town of Texas was. If you go up, so people were mentioning Towson, Lutherville, there's the train goes right through, the commuter train all the way up to Hunt Valley. That was the original Baltimore sort of Susquehanna line that went up and sort of ran parallel with the York Road. And there's just a blow up image where it says Texas, Lutherville, just to give you an idea of kind of where it is, but I'm sure everybody really knows where it is. And that quarry's still in production. So you really can't miss it, especially when you're flying into Baltimore. You look down, you'll see this massive quarry. But that's what brought the Irish there. The first was in the 1830s, was building the railroad, but that was a handful of Irish laborers coming through. But really, the Cockey family was the one that really started creating the quarrying at a more commercial or industrial sort of standard. And that's where you needed this labor. And what happens is the Irish famine, the Great Hunger, happens at the same time that there's this amazing need for limestone products, both limestone marble, but also limestone. And it's kind of get complicated. I won't go down a rabbit hole too much. But also at the same time, Maryland is experiencing agricultural revolution or change. And they call it more agricultural capitalism, but they're reducing tobacco crops. And they're going into more agriculture, more farming, corn, wheat. So what happens is with tobacco absolutely depletes all nutrients from the soil, right? So the limestone, when you burn it down and you add some additives, becomes this amazing fertilizer. So at the same time that they're deciding to go to farming, and at the same time, there's all these building projects going on. They need the marble and the limestone. And in the middle of this, the famine happens in Ireland, right? So you have thousands of Irish immigrants coming to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and then they start coming to Baltimore. They get rerouted and brought in. There's this need for labor, right? So it's just the images of actually Texas in the late 19th century into the 20th century of what that, and Beaver Dam, I should say also, it goes up the road, all this quarrying. And you can see in some of the images of how they cut the block to make the limestone building blocks. And then in the top, my top right is the limestone kilns, which are still standing. If you walk along the train tracks along Beaver Dam Road, you can see some of the kilns that are behind the Lowe's. There's that big shopping center, that Lowe's there. Those kilns are still standing. So this is really the heart and soul of Texas forming, and it becomes the occupations, the unskilled and then semi-skilled and then skilled labor, depending on what you're doing in the quarries. And then ultimately by the 20th century, a lot of these Irish American families take over the small kilns or the small quarries and for a short time become quite successful in their own right in putting out limestone block. Now, the reason why I give you that, just that little overview, is because Texas is famous, at least in my vantage point, and not many people realize this, but they provided the building block for the first 153 feet of the Washington Monument in DC. And people don't really realize it, but if you've ever stood and stared at the monument, there's two different color stone. So the lower half is a whiter color, and then the rest of the monument is a different color altogether, a little darker. Texas became the center of attention. In fact, it almost became the capital of Baltimore County. It almost became the sort of county seat because there was so much money going through because of the product of marble and then the limestone fertilizer. But it was the contract to help build the Washington Monument in DC that really put them on the map. And at that point, just to sort of throw you another historical curveball, this is at the same time of the gold rush in San Francisco. And there's newspaper accounts that say in Maryland, the type of marble that's coming out of Beaver Dam and then into Texas, as well as the fertilizer they're producing, is worth more in weight than gold coming out of San Francisco, right? So at the height of the gold rush, this is more valuable, but it's a short-lived boom and it becomes an absolute bust. And that's really the tragic history of Texas. But the first 153 feet belong to them. And again, it goes back to this anti-immigrant, anti-Irish, and anti-Catholic sentiment. And I won't bore you too much with the details of the building of the monument, but there was a monument building society, and they were getting donations, getting funding, and basically there were three heavy hitters, one of them Griscom, to get the contract to produce the stone. Well, this is urban legend, but it got back to the committee that one of the cornerstones that were coming out of Texas was donated by the Pope, and that they've made a mark, or it said this is the Pope stone. Now, remember what I said, we take an oath of allegiance to become an American citizen, and it's, you know, the fear of this Pope being, you know, rising up and creating a revolution. So here they are, apparently hiding this cornerstone that's etched with the Pope's donation. So rumor has it that they go in, they tear out the cornerstone. It apparently is in the Potomac River. Now, there's underwater archaeologists that have tried to find this stone, and they have not. I don't know if it's an actual thing. But what happens is this is by the 1850s, right before really the Civil War, so going almost into 1860, is the Know Nothing Society takes over the building of the monument. So the Know Nothing is this really staunch, very conservative American sort of political party that's anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, and by the very nature, anti-Irish. And they shut all of the production down. A especially because of this Pope stone. And it sits just like you see in the left of the screen. It sits like that until the 1870s. Post-Civil War. And what they do is in the spirit of unification, the new Monument Society, the Know Nothing's gone. They died on the vine long before that. This new Monument Building Society says, hey, listen, let's bring everybody together, north and south, east and west. It's going to be a big sort of love fest. So when you go up into the monument, you'll see every stone is dedicated from a state in the Union in the 1870s. So basically they bypassed Texas. Texas now, this is what the crash happens in the 1870s for Texas, but there's all these marble stone that gets donated by every state. So it's like always like a happy story, and then it sort of crashes. So I just tell you this because this is why Texas is fascinating. It's also fascinating for another thing with the Irish, which I'm going to end up with. But this is really, in terms of American history, makes Baltimore County, makes Texas, I think, a prominent figure, right, in that chapter. And also, for me, my research is that I don't know how many times we've all stared at either pictures of the monument or been to the monument, take relatives, friends, visitors to the monument. We never think about where these materials actually came from. Who cut them? What were their lives like? You know, did they take part in this American experiment? Because this is a heritage monument to George Washington, but really to freedom, to sort of the birth, the birthing of the United States, the creation of, the 13 colonies becoming overthrowing this colonial power. And yet the Irish, especially in Texas, become excluded from that narrative. So these are all sort of this backdrop that really fascinates me about how immigration sort of plays out in the United States, and to understand the experiences of people that lived through this, right? That labored and died. The other thing about Texas is that they basically have provided the building stone for a lot of, I'm not going to say all, I won't push them too far, but a lot of the building infrastructure of Maryland, whether it's down in DC, the porticos of the Capitol came out of the Beaver Dam quarries all the way down to Texas, limestone building block. The upper right is where I work in University of Maryland, and a lot of the limestone and the marble steps. And again, the porticos came from Texas. From the turn of the 20th century till about 1920, pretty much all the marble for Baltimore row house stairs came from Texas all the way up to Beaver Dam. You can tell how it differs from other marble is because, again, you can see those pictures. It's a bright white. That really falls out of favor with the rest of the United States. They like that pink kind of granular marble you get in Pennsylvania. So that's another reason why sort of Texas falls by the wayside. But the City Hall, the Washington Monument in Baltimore, I could literally go on and go to Philadelphia and tell you all the buildings. So there was a lot of money being made, not by the Irish immigrants or the Irish Americans laboring, but by the quarry owners themselves. But it sets this idea of the labor that was there and the important labor that really gets left out of a lot of the historical narrative, as well as the archaeological narrative. Most people bypass these little towns and go for the more, whether it's colonial Maryland or industrial Maryland, they kind of leave this part of the story alone. So I think Texas was long overdue to come out and have people sort of celebrate its history and its impact on American infrastructure. So the story starts for me at the Great Starvation or the Great Hunger. We also know it as the potato famine, the Irish famine. And this is why they're here. Okay, so the one thing I always start with in terms of diaspora is it's not necessarily push-pull factors, which you get with a lot of immigrant stories. They were looking for a better life. They wanted to come and work. This population was actually forced out, whether they were forced out by disease, by hunger, or by landlords evicting them, in essence, making them homeless, and then providing a little bit of money to say, we'll put you on a boat and we'll get you out of here somewhere, right? There was assisted immigration. So it sets up a mindset that's really hard to get at when you're doing archaeology, but we're all anthropologists, right, in training. So we want to understand the people that are owning the very things we're excavating. So this trauma, this history of eviction, of death, of starvation, you know, they bring it with them. They don't leave Ireland and sort of leave all that baggage in Ireland and come here and they're all happy and, you know, it's sunshine and puppy dogs and they just become American. There's a long history to this, and it happens throughout the United States. I've worked in places in Boston, New York City, and there's a sort of a post-traumatic stress in how they sort of navigate and negotiate where they are, right? And they're coming into a very hostile situation in the United States, especially as being Irish Catholic and for the most part unskilled. So this is the reason why they're here. They're not here for any other purpose. It's not like they chose to necessarily come here, but they make a lives for themselves. And that's really the important thing. So I have those sort of balls juggling up in the air at the Great Hunger. We have Maryland switching from tobacco to agricultural produce. And at the same time, we also have this need for American infrastructure. The one of them is the Monument Building Society needing this large contract for building block. So what we start getting is this valuable labor. They become redundant and not wanted in Ireland. They come to the United States and they're much needed because there's no labor to do it. So that's really where they find themselves when they come in through Baltimore, and then they sort of travel out into Baltimore County. And if you're ever interested, maybe I could do a tour if people, I don't have a pontoon boat or anything, but we could start in Baltimore and work our way up the York Road and by Belvedere and through all the way to Texas and beyond up to Belfast and other places where all these Irish communities started, very small Irish communities, but they follow the York Road and they follow the railroad. Which is, it's a really fascinating story. So how they get to Texas isn't really that clear cut, right? They end up in Baltimore and sort of are brought to Texas. Now, how they're brought to Texas is an interesting thing. Richard Payton is one of those people that come out of Ireland during the time of the famine. He moves into the old Cocky's house right there on what's now Padonia Road, which has now been moved, that house. He buys it, lives there, and becomes a gentleman farmer. But he brings a lot of Irish with him. Most of them, or a lot of them, come from the same townland or the area that he's from, which is in Ballykilcline in County Roscommon, which is where I also had done archaeology to look at sort of pre-famine Ireland. So if you look at the map to the left, just to sort of zero in on Texas, oh, I should say, because you did ask, how did Texas get its name? I don't know, but so it used to be called Ellengowan. And it was in the 1850s, it was, you could see it on maps, it was Ellengowan. And then the idea was it was in tribute or in sort of in memory of, in some way, for those that fought in the Mexican-American War and were part of the Texan Greens, I think it was. So they renamed it Texas. Now, there's only the shortest blurb in the newspaper, and I think it's in the it's been a while. I think it's 1853 or 1854. They weren't allowed to change it, but they did it anyway. And that in itself becomes a very Irish thing to do. Right, is that they decided they were going to change it, and they did. The idea of it was for the Mexican-American War that they sort of, and the sort of creation of the state of Texas. So again, it was all tied up in that. Whether that's true or not, I haven't found anything that would prove it, 100% or disprove it. So like I said, you weren't going to be all that satisfied with that answer, but there, I told you anyway. But it became Texas, and Baltimore County wasn't happy with it, but it stuck, and it's still there today. The fire department still has Texas on the fire trucks up there by the Target. But this is an 1870s map. And if you just stare at it for a while, you could see what I mean. So this is 1870. So the Irish have been there for just about 30 years now. And then you have subsequent generations, which would be first generation Irish American. But there's McDermott's, there's Keogh's, Elwood, Scally's, Kearney, O'Hara, Callahan, Kenny's. So I would say very Irish names. I don't think that that would be in dispute. And the thing about Texas, which is interesting, is if you look at the crossroads, okay, you see where the train tracks come up. I don't know, can you see my mouse if I do that? Oh yeah, cool, that's awesome. So right here, this crossroads, that's the center of town. If you're familiar with this area, I'll just pretend like you are. The big quarry now is right here. That's right along this. This is actually Beaver Dam Road. And that continues this way down to Padonia Road, if you're familiar with any of that. Church Street is right here, and that's St. Joseph's. And so now it's a dead end. And then you can see the train tracks actually cut right through the town. And that's how they get the marble and the limestone products in and out of Texas, and then further north in Warren and Beaver Dam quarries. You can also see that, now these are only 2 cuttings, but there were more than that. These railroad offshoots, these cuttings that would turn in and they can load. Because as you see, all the lime kilns, these are the ones down here at the bottom. They're still standing today if you go out there, but they're surrounded by the industry. So the early part of town is right at the center, and these little boxes right here along the train tracks, that's these houses right here. That's an actual picture of Texas. And you can see what their front porch and their front main street looks like. They step right out into an active train tracks. In fact, when you look at census data and church records, there are children that are getting legs cut off. There's people that are getting caught in the sidings, getting hit by trains. And then one of the most common things, both in Lutherville, but more so in Texas, is the trains are steam. So they're making fire, right? And you can imagine a train racing by, and a lot of ash and charcoal they're just blowing by. The Texas roofs are wood. Now, a lot of the buildings are stone, local stone, but their roofs and front porches would catch on fire. So you'd see a lot of that in the newspapers, and you'd see a lot of the injuries that were reported. So I bring all that up is to sort of set this sort of idea, this image, that it's not so, bucolic and clean, that they're living literally in an industrial landscape. So I always tell students, and when I brought students out there, is imagine, living right in the middle of where you work, right? So not only the toxic and conditions and the hazards that are around you, but also imagine that surrounding you, and you can see all these bigger homes that come around like Galway, Bosley, Shipley. Your bosses are living on the high ground around you, right? So they really contain them in this sort of, this little valley. It's a really slight valley, but if you see it, it kind of dips down. So they're constantly being surveilled by Americans, right? And so they have to be, to a degree, you would think, on their best behavior, but they're also living in this very sort of hazardous landscape. So it's important. So we put all these pieces together when we actually to do the archaeology. Now, again, with all this said, anti-American sentiment, anti-Catholic sentiment, they're sort of living in very bad conditions. The one thing they do, which I find absolutely fascinating, is they decide to build their own church. Because think about this, and I tell students, it's like being bullied in like, second grade or, on the schoolyard. All they have to do is go along with the crowd, and they would be sort of left alone and sort of been brought into the fold. But the first thing they do is they build their own church. So this is the main part, St. Joseph's, is they quarry the stone, they get donations, they pay for the stone themselves, and they put it together. So they build a Catholic church. It takes a while. They get in there around 1846, but by the early part of the 1850s, that main part of St. Joseph's is built. They start putting on a school across the way. and they make their own their community, right? So much so that in Baltimore newspapers, they say Texas is a little slice of Irish heaven because it's so Irish, right? Now, I don't know if they're being more sarcastic than complimentary, but they do become a very insular community, not by their own devices, but really by what that social climate is around them. But I always find it fascinating that out of all the things they choose to build the one thing that means obviously a lot, if not everything to them, but it also is the very signal or very symbol of what structures their sort of alienation, if you will, from the United States. So it's a fascinating sort of confrontation almost. It's like a silent confrontation. But it's something they cling to. They get rid of a lot of things, right? A lot of things that we consider very Irish, right? A lot of the rituals, all the behaviors, a lot of the material culture, but they really cling to Catholicism. And in fact, that's what saves Catholicism, because in Ireland, post-famine, it really drops. We always think of Ireland as being very religious. The Catholic Church really sort of matures and flourishes in the United States by the end of the 19th century. And it's more so Irish immigrants and Irish Americans, which is another very fascinating story. But just to give you an idea, a lot of this housing stock is still standing. Some of it, unfortunately, is gone. There's a Lowe's on one side, there's a Home Depot on the other. And, you know, the Beaver Dam Road has been extended. That quarry has taken up the entire, so if you look at this map, this entire half of the town, completely gone. So the archaeology is spotty at best, and we had to sort of pick and choose where we can find open places where we think people would throw away their garbage, because there is no garbage pickup in the 19th century. So we usually look for, you know, wells, ice houses, privies, you know, things that are in the back of the house where they can, you know, things that break and they sort of sweep it out and throw it out. So we did some testing and we looked in a lot of these houses, and we did find sort of an open spot that was behind this building. Now is gone. That's where this tree line is. But this used to be McDermott's bar. And then the McDermott's was here, and then the Kenny family lived here throughout the last half of the 19th century. And McDermott's was there up until I think everything got torn down by the late 1970s or early 1980s when they expanded, or the late 80s, I should say, when they expanded Beaver Dam Road. There's a lot of Texas residents that are still in the Maryland area. I know I worked with, and I don't know if anyone knows her, Cassie Kilroy Thompson. Her family is from Ballykill-Klein, along with Richard Payton, but also in Texas. There's the Friends of Texas Maryland Facebook site, which is still running. She's a public historian now, so she's doing great work there. So we sort of worked off each other and looking for different spots to find where we can, you know, do archaeology. And we got two things the first year. So I run these field schools and students get credit, and it's sort of an outdoor classroom, and they learn how to do archaeology and why we do it and why it's important. So they go from excavating to working in a lab to writing things up. And what we found here is, you see at the bottom were two features, right? It's sort of formed an L, but you see this dry laid stone box, and then that's sort of cut by this concrete box. Those were two ice houses, one earlier than the other. And obviously the Portland cement one was later dating, and it dated to the later early 20th into the mid 20th century of McDermott's bar. So as you can imagine, I think we pulled out, I think 200 or 300 Arrow beer bottles. They were all stored here, you know, and a couple of driver's licenses. It was a lot of bar oriented stuff. But underneath that was a storage ice house that belonged to the Kennys and a couple of our other Irish families that were living there in the mid to late 19th century. So that was exciting to find. And I'll show you the artifacts in a minute as we move through. The other year, again, in this open field, we found features related to this house, which is now no longer there. It actually burned down in the early part of the 20th century, but it belonged to the Callahan family. And it was one of these small boxes right here. And where we excavated is that red box in their backyard. And again, we found another ice house. We didn't find any privies, but we found the ice houses. And that was pretty cool because basically when it was open, they were storing stuff in there. And it turns out that that store in the night, or that I should say, now I gave it away, that house in the late 19th century was operating as a store. You could see it in the census. So I think what was happening is it wasn't so much in the house, but it was in this large squared structure. It's at a crossroads. And let me go back if I can. It's at a crossroads in the back lots of these houses to get to the kilns, to get to the church, and to get to the kilns down here. And based on some oral history we collected of people that lived there, there was also a bar or a pub called Annie's that was tucked back in here. So this space where they're excavating right here, this space became more of a social space for the people of Texas, which makes sense in a way because it's out of the view of A, the church, and B, if you're there and looking at, you know, surveillance, the houses that would have been that would have belonged to the owners of the lime kilns and quarries, the houses that the Texas people are living in kind of shields them from it. So it became this different social space. So what we found in these features is really quite interesting. So we worked there for a couple of years, and we did find a lot. Now it ranged from the mid 19th century, which becomes something of a faint echo, right? Because you figure people are living there for over 130, 140 years in the same spot. So things get erased and things get covered over and buried. So it becomes a lot of noise. And what you get is the last sort of big habitation. And a lot of the artifacts we get are from the 1930s to the 1960s. But underneath that, you get these really subtle layers. And that's what we did when we laid out the artifacts in the lab. Now, I should say there was an earlier archaeological excavation done by a company when they expanded the Beaver Dam Road to Padonia. They did a full excavation of places that would have had an adverse impact based on construction. In archaeology, if you don't know, it's part of the Nature Society. It's part of the environmental impact statement. So if you're using government money to do building of any sort, you go out and you do an environmental impact statement. How is this going to affect, you know, plants, animals? How is it going to affect waterways, streams, floodplains, et cetera? Well, underneath that, since the late 1960s, there is also a cultural heritage impact statement that has to be done, right? So there's the natural environment, and there's this small clause, it's called 106, in there that says you have to look at the cultural environment, right? And, you know, so it goes from Native American, indigenous populations to when it gets into the historic period, it revolves more around important events, important people. So this kind of got included because of the quarry, less so because of Irish immigrants, but more so because of the industrial part. And they made a big play for, you know, the agricultural industrialism happening in Maryland at that time, so on. So I take it a reverse tact and I look at the Washington Monument. I think Texas would have been preserved if that company had said they built the bottom half of the Washington Monument and all these other architectural structures throughout Maryland. It's a very key point. So whatever, it happened. So they did a full-on excavation. And when you do that in contract archaeology, that means basically when you say it's done, they eradicate all the archaeology. So whatever was left in terms of the historic fabric, the road crew, the construction just annihilated it. But we still have those artifacts, and we sort of married them together to create a bigger picture of what was going on in Texas. And it provides an interesting sort of assessment. And that's really what we have on these tables. And this only gives you sort of a small portion of the amount of artifacts that we found just on those tables. If you look in this picture, we have hundreds of these white boxes. And in these white archival boxes are bags and bags of more artifacts that we pulled out of these features. So it was a really rich place to do archaeology. And you can see we start putting them together like puzzles, right? We get them. So all these things are broken, right? We get the little shards of glass or sometimes you see in this picture, some come out whole, but mostly we get them broken. And then students will spend hours and hours putting them together. And a lot of times we'll make, half or sometimes even whole vessels. And then we get an idea of how many vessels, right? How many things people have. Because it's really hard to look at sherds and get an idea of the types of things that people had in their houses, right? So it's a big process. So maybe someday we could all, when this pandemic, we could put it behind us ideally. You can come down to my lab in College Park, or I can bring it up to the Historical Society up by Texas in Baltimore County, and we could sort of look at these artifacts and see how they fit together. I have a student that's running or is about to run an exhibit at the Baltimore County Historical Society on the children of Texas and what it was like to be a child in this very hazardous industrial environment. So stay tuned for that. But these are what the artifacts look like when they come out of the ground. And then this is sort of what they look like when we put them together. Ideally, we get enough to get an idea of what they were. And it was no surprise to me. It was a surprise to a lot of people how much stuff we had, that the Irish immigrants and then subsequent Irish American generation actually had nice things. If you look at and read descriptions about the Irish immigrants, about Irish laborers, about the Irish families throughout the 19th century, they're poor, they're dirty, they're backwards, they're not American, they don't eat like us, they don't decorate their homes like us, they just have things that are, I mean, there's countless descriptions. Everything's broken. If they had a teacup, it's chipped and the handle's broken, the chair is broken, the table is cut in half. They're just sitting on the floor, right? So there's all these descriptions about it. So the beauty of archaeology, I think, is when you find this stuff, right? You can put it up, and I have. That's one of the things I wrote about in my book, is you put it up against American working class family material culture at the same time. And it's the same type of way of decorating your home, the way of setting a table. It may not be as fancy as others, have in middle class and the Victorian sort of wealthy. But what you get a sense of is by looking at all the different plates, teacups, saucers, right, is how families created a sense of home. And that's sort of universal, right? It's what makes us human, is no matter what the home is, right, we automatically create something with it and have things that are uniquely our own. And you think of all the meals that are shared, right, all the dinner plates that we have, and you think of them sitting drinking tea and maybe even socializing and having people, other Texas residents coming over, and the bonds of friends and family. So you start getting an idea that people had money, right? So they weren't just sort of these mindless, half human people just, working and then sitting in the darkness, right? They went out and they bought things, they consumed things that were relatively contemporary. And it's not shocking in terms of being sort of unskilled labor that some of their possessions are out of date in terms of fashion. And when it comes to teacups and ceramic plates, they're sort of like the influencers of the day, right? You had to have the right amount of ceramic plates. You had to have the right size plates. You had to have the right accoutrements for tea. So that was a very American sort of ritual. And you were judged how you deviated from that. So the less you owned, the less you were part of that sort of mainstream. And what we found was in archaeology was quite the opposite, that the Irish immigrants were trying to be part of the American system, right? They were trying to sort of raise their family in a new world, albeit relatively hostile, right? And then we get all this other types of objects that point to different things and really kind of tug a little bit at heartstrings. The presence of children. So my student, Samantha Matero, who is actually a a Baltimore County resident who went to St. Joe's, so she has a real keen interest in this, that there were children there. And we see it in the census data, but you don't really feel the child's presence until you see things like the frozen Charlotte dolls, and you get the doll parts, and then you get the toy teacup and toy saucers, and you get marbles, and you get all these different sort of things. This is a child's plate that has a biblical reference or a reference to the Bible. We had other plates and cups that would have names on them or the alphabet. And what you get is the idea of family, but also of learning. So what anthropologists and archaeologists have argued in the past is the concept of toys, right? We don't get toys in Ireland. I haven't yet, right? We don't get these doll parts in the mid-century, 19th century and earlier. We certainly don't get toy tea sets, but we get them in the United States. And why that becomes important is because they learn, right? They learn different values and different rituals. And people have argued in terms of gender, right? Of the idea of the tea party, the tea set, how to set a table, right? What items you would need, right, to decorate a table. So the toy tea sets would be not only for leisure, for fun, but also had a lesson attached to them, right, of what you were supposed to do when you were an adult and had a home. Of course, they argue about dolls were also for sort of the idea of creating young girls into the habit of the domestic sort of raising a family. So this is at the sort of height of the cult of domesticity in Victorian America, where it was the separation of home and the workplace, where the man would actually work outside the home. And it was the mother, the head of the house, the female head of household, to create what they would quote a domestic heaven, right? So to have all these sophisticated and enlightened sort of rituals and educational activities. And so people are arguing for that. Now, this becomes strange in a very industrial environment where they are unskilled laboring families. They are, for the most part, and part of the working class, poor, but they are learning this, right? They are getting these lessons. And the fact that when you have things with writing on it, one could argue sort of they are literate, which is, again, goes against a lot of what people were arguing in terms of Irish immigration and unskilled immigrant labor. Again, the idea of buttons too, we get the idea of clothing and the types of clothing they would have had. Very simple, very basic for the most part, which makes sense. The idea of finding a lot of buttons also reflects the idea of, and I think we all do this, whether we have a junk drawer or a bag, of collecting buttons in order to put buttons back on when you lose things. So we lose a lot of buttons. So you get the idea of mending. We get thimbles, we get straight pins, we get the idea of mending clothes, the types of clothes that they're wearing, and it really gives an insight into sort of their negotiation and their dress. Now, the idea of smoking pipes, I'm going to get to in a minute, but they're the smoking pipe stems. We found hundreds of them. They were all over the place. For us in the mid-19th to late 19th century, the stem diameter really doesn't do much for us. It's more of an earlier sort of time to really measure, but it's the bowls and what's on the bowls. That's really important, and I'll get to that in the next slide. But really just the last two things down here, these are religious medals that we found in the features, which are really interesting. One was of the Virgin Mary. The other was for St. Joseph. And it gives the idea, again, of religion, of religious medals, whether it's on rosaries or saints' medals, the idea of Catholicism, right? The idea of the influence, the impact, and the presence of the church. And we know that from the building of St. Joseph's, but the idea that it was basically, throughout the community. So again, it's the idea of bringing everything together. It's this contradiction between becoming American, but holding steadfast in some of the original sort of cultural elements of their lives, which would have been Catholicism. So going into the tobacco pipe bowls, right? They become very standard at this time. But I was saying before how these bowls become like the printed T-shirt or the bumper sticker today. What's stamped on them, what's decorated on the bowl becomes more important than the actual smoking pipe themselves. And what we've gotten here in Texas, what I've gotten in Virginia, working on the Blue Ridge Railroad, in New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, so on, all the way out to San Francisco, it's ubiquitous, is Irish slogans on smoking pipes. So early on, I don't know how well you guys can see. I don't know if you can blow it up. It's probably hard to see. But the one right here, this is one of the earlier pipes. It's sort of the 1850s to 1870s. And it's got a Celtic harp. And it'll have the maker's mark and it'll say Dublin on it. But a lot of times it'll say home rule, which is very important. And basically what's interesting about this, right, is the symbols themselves. Is the Celtic harp at this time is a banned symbol in Ireland. So we know it from Guinness, from harp, beer, lager. We know it from the presidential standard of the Republic of Ireland. It's in the US, it's like the one of the go-to symbols of what it means to be Irish outside of shamrocks. However, at this time, in the 19th century, the British government actually has a ban on using this as a symbol on punishment of death. It's a sign of treason, of rebellion and uprising. It was used by the United Irishmen in the 1790s. And after that, by 1798, you weren't allowed to use that in any way. So the fact that the Irish are coming to the United States and then having pipes with the Celtic harp on it, right? It speaks volumes to their understanding of what the harp represents, but also sort of their continued attachment to, say, the homeland and the political climate that's going on, right? So there's all these different groups. There's the Irish American Brotherhood. There's the beginnings of what would be Sinn Féin, the Ancient Order of Hibernians. They all start forming through workers' unions. And a lot of them actually came through Texas. The Knights of Labor is really the front for a lot of Irish political organizing. And it's also against the Catholic Church, but that's another whole complicated story. However, we also get in the same archaeological layers, right? So we can't just say they're just Irish and they're only doing Irish things. At the same time, I'm not saying the same person smoking them, but we also get, and if you look down here, tobacco pipe with the American eagle and the American flag shield or crest. What's fascinating about this is where we get, and this is the early foundations of what it is to be Irish American in the United States. It's neither one or the other, right? Oh, they're American. No, they're Irish. It's both. They're one of the first groups to become this hyphenated generation where they see themselves as being in America, being American, right? And moving in that cultural vein. However, like Catholicism that they never drop Ireland out of their cultural DNA, if you will, right? So they're active in Irish political movements, but they're doing it through American institutions. And the biggest one at this time was the American Civil War. You have the Irish Brigades, both North and South. You have the Fighting 69 at New York, and you have, I think it's the 10th Tennessee Volunteers. I think I have that right, who basically met each other on the battlefield at the Battle of Fredericksburg and basically shot at each other, which is one of the saddest moments in Irish American history. But, you know, everyone thinks they joined the Union Army or the Confederate Army to be considered American. And it might be to some extent correct. The other thing they did it for was because of home rule, was because of a move to free Ireland. And a lot of the the Irish Brotherhood organized these different units, military units in America. Was the idea was they would get military experience and ideally equipment So after the Civil War, they would come back to Ireland and lead this uprising, which they tried in 1867, but I think only like a handful of people showed up. So it didn't work out. It was a complete bust. But also at the same time, I don't know if anyone knows this, but there were two failed invasions of Canada by Irish Americans that came out of the Civil War. They were going to go through Buffalo and up and around there. The idea was they really didn't want Canada. The idea was to create tension between the United States and England. This is post-Civil War, but not to get too deep into history, but the United States and England weren't very happy with each other because of the cotton embargo. It's a long story, but all they needed was a spark, and they were hoping to get the United States involved in a world war with England, and therefore they can leverage that to get a united Ireland. That didn't happen either. It's like a handful of people showed up. It's a very tragic story in Irish rebellions. There's always an informer, and then not everybody really kind of shows up, and then it sort of just dies and it goes away. But it's an interesting facet, right? That they're using the United States as an identity in order to promote another identity, right? This Irish identity. So we see this in the archaeological record, and it's fascinating when you juxtapose it to the types of ceramics and the American way of life that they're adopting. So just a snippet really of what I was doing in Texas. And I always say the one thing that I always try to get people to remember is ultimately when we do this, we have all these great little artifacts and religious medals and children's toys, is that we got to remember what we're trying to get at are the people themselves, right? The families, the laborers, and try to understand what their daily lives were like, right? These are what we call those silent or forgotten people. So when we stare at the Washington Monument, ideally I can get people to say, oh, that bottom half was made by these people, the McDermotts, the Callahans, the Kennys, the Scallys, these Irish immigrants that, were forced out of Ireland and had nothing and ended up here in the middle of Baltimore County and had a very, strong impact in American life. So I always sort of have that image of people to remind us this is really who we're working with. And just to end, this is the work that was done in Ballykilcline in Roscommon. And this is where families like the McDermotts, the Scallys, and the Kilroys and others that came over. And Payden, Richard Payden was famous, and this is one of the sites he lived nearby. This is the Nary family. They ended up in Chicago, another story. But they were involved in one of the first prolonged and successful rent strikes against the British Empire. The Queen owned Ballykilcline and hundreds of thousands of acres, and they refused for about a decade to pay rent. And it was successful, and they were happy, and they didn't pay this rent. However, once the accounting got through and they realized people weren't paying their rent, you can expect the other shoe to drop, and that's what happened. And people were evicted. And this is right before the famine when it starts happening. And then the famine happens and the evictions amp up because not only are they 10 years in arrear, but they can't even pay rent that week or that year. So there's massive evictions. And when you're evicted, you don't get 30 days notice, right? They come with the bailiff, they come with a battering ram where they light your thatch roof on fire and you're thrown out. So whatever you can grab and take with you, that's what you take, and that's it. You're thrown out on the street. Now, I tell you all this as an ending story because Richard Payden was one of the 7 defendants that were up in a murder trial. Because some of the people in Texas, Payden included, were part of a plot to assassinate, and they did assassinate, a landowner, the owner of the land that was sort of buying it through and working with the British Empire. And he was assassinated on the way home one night. And that was the first landowner in Irish history to be assassinated. And what that started was both a military presence in Ireland, but also the idea of assassinating landowners during the famine. But it all started in this place called Ballykilcline in County Roscommon. And a handful of those people ended up in Texas, Maryland. And Richard Payden becomes a murder defendant in Ireland, comes to Baltimore, and he's listed as gentleman farmer when he comes to Texas and Baltimore County. So how that story played out is for another time and for some good sleuthing in the archives. So I'll end there. I hope it wasn't too long and somewhat interesting. And again, I thank you very much for listening and having me out. And I'll try to unshare. I think I did it. Did that work?
Thank you so much. That is fabulous. I know that we probably have some questions for you. I don't see any in the chat at this point, but if you want to put a question in the chat box, or if you want to raise your hand, I can let you unmute and ask a question. I'm looking for hands.
Richard Padian was an interesting character. I've been digging kind of down into his history, and like you said, he was one of the people that established St. Joseph's Catholic Church. So there's some information there about him. And yes, he's a gentleman farmer. And then you check the records over in Ireland and you're like, oh, wait a second. And I started digging because Padonia Road is named after his family.
Correct.
So yeah, it's a whole lot more story there. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, as far as I know, I mean, they end up also in New York, the Padens. And I think he's actually buried. He's buried in New York with his sons are also buried up there. So I guess there's a New York connection, and I would assume that's how he brings people down to Baltimore. I think it's through New York, which is common.
Well, he was actually buried at St. Joseph's first.
Correct. Yes.
And then and when his son William dies, he gets buried up, and there's a big monument that they built to him. And from what I've read, apparently William made his money through bootlegging up in New York.
Nice.
Or some of the sons were up there, some were down here, and yeah.
All right, Rita, you have your hand up. Let's go. What do you have to ask?
Since I lived in Manhattan for so long, and a lot of Rita's family are Irish from Manhattan and the Bronx, there's a very striking difference that the Irish, of course, in Manhattan, we had the draft riots, which were extraordinary riots. We also had a remarkable amount of violence, interfamily violence. So in the Irish ghetto that was replaced by the police headquarters, there was, and it was 2 blocks by 4 blocks, there was at least one murder a day for 364 days. And on the 365th, they missed one. And I wonder if in the small communities that you studied, if there was a lot more cohesiveness, a lot less violence, people supported each other. And what do you think of that?
Yeah, so I'm from New York as well. My mom's up in the Bronx and Queens, the Irish there as well. But so I did my excavations and wrote part of my book on the 5 points, and that's what you're talking about in Lower Manhattan. So that was a predominantly Irish neighborhood. It was also free and runaway African American that were either free or running away from slavery, as well as Germans, and then surrounded in the Bowery and stuff by native born. So to speak to that end of the violence or the lack of community cohesion, yes and no, but that's an urban environment versus sort of, and I'd put Texas, at least in the 19th century, is more of a rural environment, but it's not, farms, they're clustered together. So I think the dynamics are different. However, I would say based on the archaeology and based on the sort of alternative histories to the sort of American-born descriptions of, say, the 5 points, there were a lot of political movements coming out of the 5 Points. I mean, they took over Lower Manhattan. This is pre-Tammany. They became ward bosses and sort of through the pubs, through the saloons, and moved out in a very cohesive way that sort of provided avenues for employment. And again, it's a different dynamic because you're in the city. So, you know, there's not much. In one hand, there's not much in the way of employment. On the other hand, there's a lot of employment if you can find someone to speak up for you or to put you in a channel, whether it's working the docks or it's, you know, even street cleaners. Not that they were unionized, but they were part of the political machine on the one hand. And also the draft riots is another really ugly period in Irish American history. In part of it understandable, part of it just you know, it kind of went off the rails, was the idea of, you know, seeing the conscription, right, list. This is the story, that there's the draft list on one side of this table where the guy's sort of recruiting to fight for the Union Army. This is just after Gettysburg. And on the other side of this table is the list of the dead and missing. And wouldn't you know it, predominantly Irish names, surnames on the dead, missing, and captured. And on the recruitment list, on the conscription list, predominantly Irish surnames, because if you had $300, you can pay someone to go in your place. And that was a lot of American-born men did. And right, and Irish immigrants that are poor and unskilled would take that 300. That's a big sum at that time. So in terms of unity, in a strange way, they do get together and burn a good part of New York City down. So I don't know if you want to call that cohesiveness. It's a bit far out there, but the dynamics are different. You know, you go from urban dynamics to the more rural. But you know, they had different avenues of opportunity and constraint. Yeah. So I mean, I would kind of leave it there. What's that?
I was thinking of cohesiveness. I was thinking of the people in Texas. Did the families help each other? Somebody got sick, they watched each other's children, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And real quick, I'll just tell you, I talk to people now, people that were either born in Texas right before it ended, or they were there, depending on how old they are. There is still a cohesive mindset about Texas, still, if they were from there. And I heard stories about, I mean, they would leave their children with other families. The rate of widowhood increased as the 19th century progressed into the 20th century. There was a lot of overwhelmed families and a lot of cross marriages. There's a lot of families that share, you know, a handful of Irish surnames that it's like they sort of intermarried in that community. Not many sort of moved out. So yeah, there's an amazing cohesiveness, and it's still there. The Facebook, Friends of Texas, Maryland, people put up pictures and stories all the time. It's amazing.
Okay, what was the population of Texas at the time?
Population in terms of numbers, or?
Yeah, I think population. Pat wants to know population number of Texas at the time.
Man, yeah, that's a great question. I'd have to go to my notes and blow the dust off. I would say, well, there's maybe in the beginning, and I'll give you a rough guesstimate. There's between, you know, in the beginning, 10 to 30 families. In the middle part of the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, that grows exponentially. But it wasn't a lot. It was a small community. I know that doesn't help you. But I would say, I'm just trying to think of how I've gone through the census data. I would say a few hundred, more than say a few thousand, you know, and I'm not counting, you know, Beaver Dam, Ashton, Warren. I'm just considering Texas itself.
All right. And Jim was interested to learn do you know if there's a man named John Carroll Walsh in your studies that was a quarry or kiln owner?
Wow. I would say off the top of my head, no. But I would also say I could put you in touch with Cassie Kilroy Thompson. She would tell you every name that ever existed in Texas. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's one of them. The Fells family, Griscom, Shipley, Bosley, every big name you can put in Baltimore County, Baltimore, had kilns up there. Then the Irish do take over, but the Walsh, it doesn't ring a bell off the top of my head. I wish it did.
And Karen, well, going on that, Karen says, what are some good resources to learn more about Texas? It seems like you've lit a spark of curiosity in her about this area.
Great, I love it. You know what? There isn't. That's really what's hard. There's a lot of oral history. I'd say go on the Friends of Texas, Maryland. I'm trying to write a book now about Texas. So basically what I just talked about as a sample is really just sort of like the idea of the book I'm writing, starting off with the Washington Monument and bringing it into the Irish leaving Ireland. And this is, their experiences here in the larger scheme of things. So, if this interests you, stay tuned. But there's a lot of primary documents. You can go to St. Joseph's, go to the Baltimore County Historical Society, the Baltimore City, the library, the Maryland archives. If you're interested, I would say email me. I can give you the resources. There's some really good 1920s writings about St. Joseph's, about the being Catholic in Texas, but there isn't a cohesive book or articles except for what I've done so far. And that's why it's taken like a million years, because it's really hard, because Texas it existed, nobody knew, and then it disappeared, but it's still there. That's the thing, but in memory. So no one has really done anything with it. So if anybody wants to work on it, I'd love to work with people.
That's great. We have you might have been recruiting some researchers for your project. So Ethan wants to know what brought an end to Texas, if there really was an end. So you kind of intimated that there was, but it's still there.
Yeah. It's a long story, but there was a furniture company that was put there, a gigantic building that burnt down, but I think that was arson. Another long story. That was in the 1930s. And that really actually, once the quarries closed, they actually hired everybody there. There were all these unskilled quarry laborers. Once that died out, I think the first death knell, if you ask me, of Texas was when they didn't get asked to provide any building stones by the 1870s for the Washington Monument. By that time, they really fell off the map. So it was a very slow, painful decline, I think, for the people living there, because they start, you see the newspapers, and that's another place. Look at all the newspapers in the 19th century, and there's all these different reports of violence. So we did talk about cohesiveness. There's a little bit of violence in Texas. Most of it's over about labor unions and strikes. Also, Texas there is no such thing as a pure, ethnic town, for example. So there wasn't just the Irish there. There's American born. Poe is a big family name that's there. There's a Lutheran, and there's also I think it's Presbyterian church around us. So there's also non-Catholics in here. There's also African Americans. So there's a Zionist church up York Road going towards Cockeysville, maybe like 3 miles or so. So they start hiring African Americans as well. So they get that that move post-Civil War, right, from African Americans moving north. That hits Baltimore and then comes out. So it's a really complicated story. So that really, there's a struggle for employment and money, but yet no one wants to leave. Again, the cohesiveness, the contradiction, the struggle, that it's a slow decay. all the fancy Baltimore, natives that so well, their last names, they pull out a long time ago. They kind of abandon or sell these kilns and quarries at a real cheap rate. Nobody wants the product. The Irish Americans start doing it. And again, Baltimore steps, they sort of find this niche. But by 1920s, there's nothing there for them. And it turns into what it is today, which is just this giant quarry that if you live there, and I felt bad for the people that do, they're kind of hanging on even today, is there's tons of explosions that go on because they're blowing up at the quarry, and you feel it. We're across the train tracks, across Beaver Dam Road, and next thing you know, the ground is shaking. The dust, I took a tour of the quarry. I don't know how they do it today, but it's all white dust. You go into these offices, it just hangs there. Everything's coated on the other side where the rest of Texas is. It's still kind of a hard scrabble place to be, and those houses are slowly being, abandoned even today. So it's just really bizarre, very American Rust Belt, slow decline, kind of thing. So that's why I think Texas is a fascinating sort of snapshot in American history.
And then Jeff has his hand up. Jeff, did you have a question?
Yes. Now, you just sort of touched on part of what I was going to ask, but maybe we can build on that a little bit. I mean, it looked like, particularly from that map, at least early on, it's such a densely Irish area. It may not be absolutely cohesive. I assume that is primarily because the town, such as it was, sprang into being because of the quarry and the labor needed to support that. Now, maybe after the Civil War, there were more blacks freed from plantations looking for low skill labor kinds of jobs that they could get. But I kind of wonder how diverse the population might have actually been. I mean, they were taking over land that would not have been very heavily populated. It would have been big farms, I assume. It couldn't all have been Cocky family farm. So I just was sort of wondering how that diversity of the population, it looks like it started very Irish and maybe became much less so as that kind of skilled labor was the only thing available, and lots of people were fighting for those jobs.
I mean, that's exactly it. Hit the nail on the head. I think it was predominantly Irish outside of the Poe family, which was along the railroad tracks there, and they were farming. They weren't involved in the quarrying. But it was predominantly in the late 1840s, 1850s, just up to the Civil War. I would say at that point, working the quarries, it was predominantly Irish immigrant families. So that's where I think the cohesive came in, that post-traumatic stress of what was happening in Ireland, what they left Ireland, where they came. They all came. It seems they come in a relative unit. I'm not saying all the families did, but they were sort of trafficked in a certain way. And I think that's where Richard Payton comes in. He gets them there. And I think they're coming from New York. I don't think they're coming from Baltimore proper, the city. But just to go back, it was all Cocky family property. I was surprised too, but it was all Cocky. He starts parceling.
They had very big farms in those days, so it's not impossible.
Yeah, he parcels it off to the big owners that become the big quarry owners, Fells, Griscom. They all battle it out, right? But ultimately, it's all Cockies, to the point that where we did the archaeology, I forget his first name, but I think he's passed now. But one of the last Cocky descendants who lived in Cockeysville up the hill, he came down. He had to be in his 80s, I think. He came down screaming at me because he said that's his land. Now they moved what they said they moved, the enslaved population from the original Cocky's farm, farmhouse, which Payton lived in. That they moved about, I'm trying to think, they're in a line. There have to be about 30 headstones, maybe not as much. They moved them there on this strip of land where we did.
Yeah, I remember when there was a small cemetery there, which I understand they have moved.
Right, so they moved him over to that part of Texas. He came out one time, started screaming at me. He didn't know what I was doing because he said that was his property. And he said the Cockies own all this. It's as if we time traveled, back to the 19th century. He was a character. He had a cane with a sword had a sword inside his cane, which he was very proud to show me. It was an interesting, meeting.
Good chance it's one of the reproductions, but you said they also moved a Cocky family house. Where is the house?
Okay, I could never find it.
It's off of Falls Road, Falls Road. They bought it, I think in the late 80s and moved it lock, stock, and barrel over there.
And that's an original Cocky family house?
It was
Taylor's Hall?
It was built by a tailor. It's called Taylor's Hall. The Cockies lived in it for many generations. And then they sold it to William.
I have seen references to Taylor's Hall.
Yeah. So as close as I can figure, it must have been right where the, if you know Beaver Dam Road, where the hotel is
Beaver
now.
Dam Road and Green Spring, and that's all one long road with changes names.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right where the quarry entrance is. It's like between where Beaver Dam hits Padonia and the quarry entrance, and that's why they moved it. It was all part of that memorandum. They mitigated damages, and the one thing that they negotiated was the movement. The enslaved population was moved over to that open lot in what is downtown Texas, if you will. And then I don't know who owned the plot of land they moved the house to, but it was all part of it.
There was talk several times that they were supposed to have been closing the quarry, and obviously that has not happened. It's as busy as ever.
Yeah, I see Lafarge trucks all the time, and yeah, they just come barreling out.
There was talk of filling it with water and making it into a scuba diving park, but obviously it's making more money selling limestone and whatever else they're still finding.
Yeah, I think they're only doing crushed gravel or crushed stone. I mean, again, that was the downside of the decline of Texas too. It's like their product, just the demand for it decreased, and even now it's just crushed stone.
Well, this has been phenomenal. Thank you so much, Dr. Brighton. We've touched on so many different topics that all come out: history and famine and war and culture and geology. I mean, it really has been a brain stimulating evening. So I appreciate that. And thank you all for joining us this evening for our archaeology club. You know that we have a lot going on. Ilka, you want to give a last saying for tonight?
Sure. Just thank you, everybody, for coming on board and listening to the Zoom meeting tonight. I think I'm going to see if Dr. Brighton, I want to take him up on that tour of the Irish settlements coming out York Road.
Absolutely.
Maybe we could do that. Yeah, that'll be fascinating. But thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Stay well, stay curious, and we will hope to see you very, very soon. Okay, take care, everybody. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.